Vaseline glass. So this is a very interesting one to talk about today. This is uranium-based glass. And what they did was they would imprint materials into the glass. And look, it's got a little copper cup on top. But when you get into water and everything that we place our water into, it gets very, very interesting. And the most fascinating thing was when I was researching about uranium glass or Vaseline glass, they were saying that this is toxic. If you drink out of this, you're going to get sick. And if you go back to like the 1900s, they actually used to drink out of radium water bottles. That used to be the big thing. And if you think about it, it has the same green glow as the Northern Lights. It has the same green glow as nature. But they would say that this was toxic. But what's interesting is when you think about radium, you think of the Ra, or the sun energy, the element known as 88. So when you drink this, it's like you're drinking the sun. Bottles up. But you can look on eBay, you can look on Etsy, you can look on antique stores for Vaseline glass. And what's really cool is if you take this glass and you put it up against a fluorescent bulb, you'll start to see that it glows. And this is really interesting because I've been thinking about this whole non-ionizing versus ionizing radiation thing. Non-ionizing is cell phones and devices that we use, all the nonsense that we use and blah, blah, blah. They say it's non-ionizing. They say that it's harmful too, or not harmful to it, which makes no sense. But then you have ionizing, which is the sun, and also radium or uranium. So if you think about it, drinking from a Vaseline glass is like drinking the sun. And same when we think about copper, you get that orange hue. Color spectrums going into your water. Just like when people used to walk into cathedrals and the stained glass windows would embed into the water in their body. So you have here, you have Vaseline glass, which is uranium glass, and you have copper, which is the copper pipes that everybody used to have in their house. So when you think about these two things going into the system, one is bringing back life, which is Vaseline glass, and bringing back the radiation of the body. And then you have copper, which is bringing back the electrical conductivity of the water. This is why everybody used to have copper pipes, even why Zuckerberg has copper pipes. But these are two fascinating ones to get into when you're drinking your water. What you put your water in will take on an imprint of whatever it may be. Copper being one, Vaseline being another. But it's very fascinating when you get into this topic because they tell us, stay away. It's always the same story. Stay away from that Vaseline glass. Stay away from the uranium. But if you think about alchemy, and you think about how somebody imprinted a material into this glass, it really starts to make you think about how you could take something, put it into this glass, and every time you sip it, you would be sipping uranium. And then we go back into like the radium girls, if you guys remember that whole story. They were talking about the radium girls and how they were licking paintbrushes the entire time and painting clocks and doing things like that. So if we think about that story, it doesn't make a lot of sense to lick paint all the time. But it's interesting because one of the radium girls lived to 107. So that's another interesting thing. But, you know, when we get into this whole thing of glass, we can think of even like Bohemian glass. You know, the Vaseline glass relates to Bohemian glass and all the glassware that they would make in Bohemia. Bohemia was one of the leading countries when it came to glass, and they would imprint materials into the glass. So when we get into this whole situation, then we start to sit there and think, wow, you could imprint things into glass. And when you look at Bohemian crystalware, you're drinking a frequency every single time, which is going into the body or into the water of your body, and then starting to take on that principle. But the first time I drank out of this, it was wild. It's very energizing. It feels like I've been sitting out in the sun, which I have. I've been sitting out in the sun a lot, but it feels even more energizing with the sun. And I actually charge this water with the sun too. I put this water out with the sun, and the sun will imprint into this water, and it'll charge it up as well. But when you look into Vaseline glass, you can look on Etsy, you can look on eBay. It's a very fascinating topic, and it was funny because it came with a copper cup, which is funny. So we got copper and Vaseline glass. So, you know, you get into this whole topic and you start to sit there and think, we used to have copper for everything. A little copper hat. Actually, I could probably wear that for the rest of life. But, you know, when we get into this, you get into Vaseline glass and uranium glass, and then you also get into the whole nuclear hoax. You know, the whole thing about they were dropping nukes during the 1940s. that was a hoax. There was no nukes that were being dropped. What they were doing was they were firebombing. And you can get into this whole topic. You can look into firebombing and that whole situation. But the nuke hoax was just a bunch of nonsense. They're trying to scare people and get them into believing that they're going to drop nukes all over the place. But that was all debunked right after the 1940s. And that's the thing. They try to scare us with all this nonsense and try to keep us away from uranium and not realize that uranium and radium connect to helium, which connects to flying blimps. Which means that if a person has radium, that they could create a blimp and start flying around. So this is a real fascinating one when you get into it. Uranium glass, Vaseline glass, and the fluorescent glow. The other thing I think about is the fluorescent glow of this glass also is emitting a color spectrum, which can be very healing. Now, I had a friend who they took Vaseline glass and they put water in it, and they had another glass next to it, and they looked at it through the window, and they could see more bubbles in the Vaseline glass than the traditional glass. So if you think about structuring or hydration, we can think of the Vaseline glass as structuring water so that when you're gardening or when you're drinking water, you have structured water. It's a very fascinating topic. And like I said, I don't think anybody wants to talk about it because anytime you go about it, they're like, oh, you got to stay away from uranium glass and it's bad and blah, 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 blah. But that's the thing. The AMA and all of the 1913 Flexner Report and that whole thing was about getting people away from natural healing remedies. Even as we talked about pearl powder and we've talked about shilajit and we've talked about dragon's blood and all these things, getting people away from natural healing remedies and getting them connected to radiation and getting cut open in pills and other nonsense. So when we get into it, we want to connect